Good evening. Lately, some critics of the government have been stating that there has been a lack of growth and industrial development in the province of Saskatchewan. Probably the most noteworthy of these statements came from the leader of the Liberal Party. Mr. Ross Thatcher, speaking in the city of Toronto, as reported by the Regina Leader Post of December the 15th, is quoted as having said that the province was characterized by economic stagnation that is hard to believe. He went on to say that the province was in danger of becoming one of Canada's depressed areas. I wish you would look at that statement very carefully. I'm not going to comment on the impropriety of going to another part of Canada and describing one's own province as being almost a depressed area. I'll leave that to the people to decide whether or not it is good advertising for Saskatchewan. What I want to deal with are the facts. Is the statement true? Does Saskatchewan suffer from economic stagnation? Well, let's have a look and see. How do you measure economic growth and industrial development? Well, economists usually measure it by what they call the total value of economic production. And by that, they simply mean all the value of goods produced on our farms, in our forests, from our mines, from our fisheries, from our factories, from our power plants, the total value of all the goods and services produced by the people of this province. And in the year 1959, just closed, we had one of the greatest production periods in our history. The total value of our production reached the staggering figure of $1,432 million. Now, this was 3% higher than the year before, but it was 133% higher than in 1945. Let's look at these figures for comparison. In 1945, the total value of our commodity production in Saskatchewan was $615 million. By 1950, it had got up to $710 million. By 1955, it had reached $1,305 million. And last year, as I said, it reached the figure of $1,432 million. Now, that doesn't look very much like economic stagnation. Included in those figures, one of the most important items is mineral production. And by mineral production, of course, we mean gas, oil, uranium, copper, lead, zinc, coal, and so on. And you will see from the figures which are presented here that in 1945, the total value of our mineral production was $22 million. By 1950, it had reached $36 million. 1955, $85 million. 1958, $210 million. And last year, $214 million. And you will see that in 1959, we had almost 10 times the production of minerals in dollar value than we had in 1945. And our figure for 1960 is estimated at $235 million. Now, included in these mineral figures, as I said, was oil and gas. And I think it's rather encouraging to note that last year, although the production of oil in Alberta and Manitoba declined, the production of oil in Saskatchewan increased from $105 million in 1958 to $118 million in 1959. Manufacturing has also been an important item in the development of our province. And again, there has been a very substantial and encouraging increase. Let us look at the figures. In 1945, the total value of our manufactured products in this province was $168 million. 1950, $218 million. 1955, $295 million. 1958, $318 million. And last year, $341 million. And our estimate for this year is that we will pass the $370 million mark. Now, all of this increased production, mines, forests, construction industry, manufacturing, has resulted in a more diversified economy for Saskatchewan. Prior to the last war, less than 20% of Saskatchewan's production was non-agriculture. By 1945, it was still less than 25%. But today, almost two-thirds of Saskatchewan's total production is non-agriculture. And this is not because agricultural production has gone down. It has gone up. But in spite of that, non-agricultural production today accounts for almost two-thirds of our total production. And this has meant more jobs, more employment, more wages, and more salaries in Saskatchewan. I noticed that the leader of the Liberal Party made a statement on TV to the effect that there were 1,700 less people engaged in manufacturing today than when the CCF government took office. This, of course, is not in accordance with the facts. It is true that from 1945 to 1951, the number of persons engaged in manufacturing dropped. This was because we were reducing the cut in timber in the forest, and so sawmills had less employment. Also, after the war, we weren't shipping so much pork and meat products to Great Britain and Europe, and so many abattoirs and packing plants laid off staff. And the number of persons did drop in manufacturing up until 1951. But since that time, increased manufacturing and new industries have taken up the slack, with the result that in 1959, there were more people engaged in manufacturing in this province than at any time in our history. But why does the leader of the Liberal Party limit himself to talking about manufacturing? What about the people employed in the oil industry and in mining and in the forests and in construction and in power expansion? Let us take the total non-agricultural labor force. Leaving out the people on farms, what do we find? In 1941, it was 129,000. In 1951, it was 154,000. And in 1959, the number of persons engaged in employment other than agriculture was 191,000. This certainly would indicate that we have more people employed than we've ever had before. And what is even more important is that last year, the amount paid out in wages and salaries to these people reached the all-time record of $1,172 million. Now, a great deal has been said about population. But the fact is that population did drop during the years when our farms were becoming mechanized and people were moving away. But this situation is rapidly being remedied. Let us look at the population statistics for the province of Saskatchewan. In 1936, we had 931,000 people. It dropped in 1941 to 896, and by 1946 it had dropped to 833,000 people. I want you to notice that during most of this time we had a Liberal government in office. And yet we lost, in addition to our natural increase, almost 100,000 people. In 1951, this trend was still going down, although not quite so quickly. It had dropped to 832,000. But by 1956, we were coming back. We'd come back to 881,000. And last year, we reached 907,000. So that this talk about our population all leaving isn't quite accurate. As a matter of fact, if you take the period from 1944 to 1959, Dominion Bureau of Statistics, making a survey of all employers with employees of more than 15 in number, shows that across Canada, the increase in the number of employees has gone up by 55%. In Manitoba, the increase is only some 50.5%. But in Saskatchewan, the number of employees had increased by almost 90%. I think this indicates the type of economic growth and development which we've had in Saskatchewan during the past 10 or 15 years. In the summer of 1958, the government employed the Stanford Research Institute to make a survey of Saskatchewan's economic growth and to make recommendations as to how we might further stimulate industrial development. I'm sure you know that the Stanford Research Institute is one of the largest consulting firms on industrial development in the world. I think it's significant to look at the statement which they make in their report on page 39 and 40. It says, in the last 10 years, 1948 to 1958, mining production has almost quadrupled in value, while that of the construction industry has tripled. The net value contributed by the manufacturing sector has increased by more than 2.5 times. Now, this is not the statement of a politician. Here is the Stanford Research Institute saying that in Saskatchewan, in the past 10 years, mining has increased by 4-fold, construction 3-fold, and manufacturing by 2.5 times. I submit that this is a good record. And the Stanford Research Institute points out that the prospects for 1960 are very encouraging. Potash, pulp, chemical industry, the steel development, the iron ore deposits at Choiceland and Nipawin, and above all, the completion of the South Saskatchewan Dam. These things are helping to produce in Saskatchewan a diversified and stabilized economy. I think that instead of talking about economic stagnation, you and I can go into the 1960s confident that this decade is Saskatchewan's golden age and that our finest years lie ahead of us. Good night, and thank you for listening.